Most people do not have a housing problem in 2026 because they are lazy. They have a housing problem because they are doing math with the wrong number. They are using the number the bank likes. I use the number reality likes. And those two numbers are not the same. If you ask a bank what you can afford, the bank will usually hand you a polished little answer wrapped in percentages, mortgage formulas, and a smile. It sounds scientific, it sounds responsible, it sounds safe. But what a bank is really asking is not, can you live well in this house? It is, can you keep sending us checks long enough for us to get paid back? That is a very different question. In 2026, that difference is where a great many families get into trouble. I want to walk you through a simple exercise. I want to show you what kind of income it really takes to afford a $250,000 house, a $500,000 house, a $1 million house, and a $2 million house in this market. Not in a fantasy market, not in the market people remember from a few years ago. I mean, today, with mortgage rates around 6%, home prices still elevated, taxes, insurance, and all the little ownership costs that have a way of showing up after the closing photos are taken. And I want to be very plain about the point. The point is not to scare you. The point is to strip the delusion out of the conversation. Because once you strip the delusion out, you can make a rational decision. Before that, you are negotiating with a salesman, a lender, a real estate platform, and your own emotions all at once. That is not how intelligent capital gets allocated. If I were buying a house in this environment, I would start from one principle. Never confuse loan qualification with affordability. Qualification is a banking word. Affordability is a life word. Qualification tells you what someone is willing to lend you. Affordability tells you whether the house will quietly eat your savings, reduce your freedom, and turn the next 10 years into a treadmill. Those are two very different things. And in 2026, a lot of people are learning that lesson the expensive way. The classic rule banks use is the 28-36 rule. You have probably heard some version of it. They want your housing payment to stay under 28% of your gross monthly income, and they want all your debts together, mortgage, car payment, student loans, credit cards, whatever else you carry, to stay under 36% of your gross monthly income. That rule has one virtue. It is easy. It has one problem. Gross income is a flattering number. Gross income is the number you earn before reality takes its cut before taxes, before payroll deductions, before retirement contributions, before health insurance, before all the little slices that separate the salary on paper from the money that actually lands in your checking account. Gross income makes people feel richer than they are. That is why it is so popular. When I think about a house, I do not care what your gross income says. I care what your household can actually live on after the money shows up. That is the number that has to cover groceries, transportation, investing, repairs, clothing, emergencies, children, travel, and all the surprises that life throws at people with very little concern for their mortgage ratio. So I prefer a tougher rule. I would rather see your total housing cost stay under 30% of your net income, not your gross income. That means mortgage principal and interest, property taxes, homeowners insurance, and if applicable, HOA fees in the real world. That is much closer to a useful number because it begins with what you actually keep instead of what you briefly touch on the way to paying everyone else. Even that is not magic. It is just a better starting point. And before I walk through the 4 house prices, I want to say something else that matters. No rule of thumb can run your household better than you can. If you are maxing out retirement accounts, your take, home pay will look different from someone with the same salary who saves nothing. If you live in a high-tax state, your net will look different from someone in a low-tax state. If one spouse gets bonuses, RSs, or irregular income, your risk profile is different. If you have children, aging parents, private school, chronic medical costs, or a business with volatile cash flow, your margin for error is different. That is why I never let a calculator make a life decision for me. I use the calculator to expose the truth. Then I apply judgment. That is what we are going to do here. Let us start with the smallest number on the list because even that one is already uncomfortable for a lot of Americans. Take a $250,000 house at first glance. That does not sound outrageous in 2026. In many parts of the country, it sounds downright modest. But even a modest number starts to bite once you apply rates, cash requirements, and ownership costs. Assume a 20% down payment and a 6% 30-year mortgage. That means you need $50,000 in cash just to get to the table. That number alone eliminates a great many households before the conversation even starts. And if you do not have the 20%, you can put less down. Yes, but then you buy yourself another problem. You invite PMI into the house. Private mortgage insurance is one of those marvelous inventions where you pay for protection that benefits the lender, not you. I have always admired the elegance of that business model. It is profitable precisely because the buyer is eager and the lender is cautious. So let us stay with 20% down. You finance $200,000 at 6% over 30 years. That produces a principal and interest payment right around $1,200 a month. Then you add property taxes and insurance. And now you are probably looking at something like $1,500 to $1,700 per month all in, depending on where the house sits and how expensive the local tax regime has become. Use $1,600 and you are in the neighborhood. Now watch what happens when the bank runs the number. Under the 28% gross rule, a $1,600 payment implies gross monthly income of about $5,714, which comes out to roughly $68,500 a year. That sounds manageable. That is why people get into trouble, because that is not the life number. That is the lender's comfort number. If I apply my 30% of net income rule, the picture changes immediately. To keep $1,600 at 30% of take, home pay, you need roughly $5,333 in net monthly income. If we assume take, home pay is around 75% of gross income. That means you probably need something closer to $85,000 in gross annual salary to carry a $250,000 house comfortably without feeling the walls close in every month. Notice what just happened. The house did not change. The mortgage rate did not change. The taxes did not change. Only the honesty changed. And the required salary moved a long way. That is the first lesson a quarter. $1 million house is not a poor man's house in 2026 once you use realistic math. It may be a modest house, it may be an ordinary house, but it still demands real cash and real income discipline. Now let us double the house price and see what happens. Take a $500,000 house. This is where the American affordability conversation becomes very revealing, because in many regions this is no longer luxury, it is simply decent, a usable house in a normal neighborhood. Maybe not glamorous, maybe not coastal elite real estate, but something attractive enough that a family could plausibly want it. Use the same assumptions, 20% down, 6% mortgage. Now your required cash down payment is $100,000. I want you to pause there. The median savings in America is nowhere near that number. So when people talk casually about buying a $500,000 house, what they are often skipping over is the biggest gate in the entire process. The monthly payment matters, of course, but the first gate is cash. And in this market, cash is merciless. With 20% down, you finance $400,000 at 6% over 30 years. Principal and interest comes out around $2,400 a month. Then taxes and insurance push your total housing cost up into the $2,800 to $3,000 range. Let us use $3,000 to stay conservative. Now the bank says fine, under the 28% gross rule, you need about $10,714 a month in gross income, or roughly $128,500 a year. That sounds like a lot, and it is, but it is still not my number. At $3,000 a month, my 30% net rule says you need about $10,000 a month in take. Home pay, if take home is 75% of gross. Then you are looking at about $160,000 a year in gross household income to carry a $500,000 house with some dignity and breathing room. That is where a great deal of middle-class aspiration runs into arithmetic, because $160,000 a year is not impossible, but it is not casual either. For many families, it means two incomes, often two reasonably strong incomes. It may mean each spouse earning roughly $80,000 a year. And even then, the family still has to survive cars, childcare, insurance, groceries, taxes, and all the rest of life. What people discover at this level is that a house price does not just ask whether you can buy the house. It asks what kind of life the house leaves behind after you buy it. There are families who can technically qualify for a $500,000 house and then spend the next decade with permanently tight shoulders. No margin, no investing surplus, no real cash reserve, no room for one income to wobble, no room for a roof problem. A furnace failure, a layoff, or a child with expenses that do not read mortgage blogs, that is not ownership. That is captivity dressed up as ownership. Now let us move to the number that sounds glamorous in some parts of the country and surprisingly ordinary in others, a $1 million house. In some places, that still buys a large and impressive home. In many coastal markets, It buys normalcy, maybe a standard house, maybe a smaller house than people imagine, maybe a condo that would have sounded absurdly expensive to an earlier generation. This is where social media does a lot of damage because it normalizes expensive real estate without normalizing the income and liquidity that should stand behind it. Again, take 20% down and a 6% mortgage. Your down payment requirement is now $200,000 in cash before you discuss granite countertops, school districts, or a nice backyard. You need to answer a simple question. Do you have $200,000 available without wrecking your emergency reserves, retirement plan, and psychological stability? If the answer is no, you are not ready for the house, whatever the lender says. Finance $800,000 over 30 years at 6%, and principal and interest comes out around $4,796 per month. Add property taxes and insurance, and the all-in monthly cost easily lands between about $5,800 and $6,300. Let's use $6,000. That figure alone, using the bank's 28% gross rule, a $6,000 monthly housing cost implies about $257,000 in annual gross household income. That already puts you in a rare income bracket, but if I use the 30% net rule, you need around $20,000 a month in take. Home pay, assuming roughly 75% take home from gross, you are looking at something like $320,000 a year in gross household income to carry that $1 million house sensibly. And that is before we start discussing a detail many buyers conveniently ignore. At this level, you may be entering jumbo loan territory depending on the loan size and local lending limits. Jumbo loans are less forgiving. They often require stronger credit, more reserves, and a cleaner financial picture. In other words, the game gets harder just when the house gets more expensive. Now think about what that $320,000 figure means. It means that $1 million house is not a rich fantasy house anymore. In many markets, it is simply the house that upper-income professionals need if they want to buy a normal residence in a desirable area, but the required income is still extraordinary relative to the country as a whole. That is why affordability feels broken, because it is not just that homes are expensive. It is that the incomes needed to own them without distress sit far above where most families live. There are couples who try to stretch this anyway. They say one spouse gets bonuses or stock compensation, or maybe a promotion is coming, or maybe rates will come down later and they can refinance, or maybe home prices will keep rising and bail them out. I never like a purchase that requires several favorable future events to feel safe. That is speculation wearing domestic clothes. When I buy an asset, I want it to work if the world stays ordinary. If a family needs falling rates, higher compensation, continued job security, cooperative children, low maintenance, no health surprises, and a forgiving economy all at once, just to make the house feel okay. Then the house is too big for the balance sheet. Now let us go to the number that social media makes look more common than it is. A $2 million house. In reality, this is a tiny slice of the market and an even tinier slice of the population. But in a handful of high-cost regions, people see these prices often enough that they begin to treat them as normal. Familiar is not the same thing as affordable. Run the same assumptions again. 20% down, 6% mortgage. Now the down payment alone is $400,000 in cash. That one number should sober almost anyone. Not borrowed, not imagined, not pulled from a HELOC fantasy cash. Then you finance $1.6 million principal. And interest comes in around $9,593 per month. Add taxes, insurance, higher maintenance, maybe HOA, maybe more expensive upkeep, simply because everything about an expensive property costs more, and suddenly your total monthly burden is very plausibly $12,000 to $13,000. Use $12,500, and we are still being reasonable. Under the 28% gross rule, you need annual household income around $535,000 just to fit the lender S-box. Under my 30% net rule, you need about $41,667 in monthly take-home pay with a higher tax burden at this income level. That probably pushes required gross household income somewhere in the neighborhood of $700,000 a year to carry the property comfortably. Now we are talking about a very small group of households. 2 doctors, a senior finance professional, paired with another high earner, a successful business owner, and a well-paid spouse. A top-level tech compensation package with meaningful stock income. This is no longer about budgeting your way to the dream. This is about whether you are operating in an income class that can absorb a giant fixed obligation without panic, and that is why I say the uncomfortable truth is better than the polished illusion. A great many people do not have a housing problem because they are bad at clipping coupons or choosing coffee shops. They have a housing problem because their local market is pricing shelter at a level that demands incomes from the top slice of the national distribution. That is not a mindset problem. That is arithmetic. Now, I want to step back from the 4 examples because the examples matter less than the pattern. The pattern is what matters. At $250,000, the house sounds manageable until realistic take. Home math pushes the required income closer to $85,000. At $500,000, the bank might whisper something like $128,500. But sensible ownership pushes the figure closer to $160,000. At $1 million, the bank may say roughly $257,000, but comfort and margin start closer to $320,000, and possibly more depending on taxes and reserves. At $2 million, you are not really talking about a budgeting exercise. You are talking about whether your household belongs to a group earning somewhere around $700,000. That is the brutal ladder, and once you see it clearly, a lot of the national frustration makes perfect sense. People are not crazy when they say housing feels impossible. What they are feeling is the gap between wages and asset prices. That gap is what creates the crisis. Now, let me say something that some people do not like to hear. I do not believe your primary residence should be viewed first as a wealth machine. It may become one wonderful if it does, but that should be icing, not the cake. A house is first a place to live, a place to raise children, protect a family, sleep well, and organize a life. That is its first job. If you buy it like a speculator, you may wind up living inside your own overconfidence. That is why I dislike language that treats every home purchase as a grand investment victory. For most families, the real question is not whether the house will appreciate. The real question is whether the house will leave enough capital free for the other pillars of a sound life. Can you still save? Can you still invest? Can you still build cash reserves? Can you survive one bad year? Can one spouse stop working if life demands it? Can you absorb maintenance without treating a water heater like a national emergency? Those questions matter more than boasting that your zip code went up 11% last year. I would much rather own a simpler house with breathing room than a glamorous house financed with hope. Hope is not a capital reserve. Hope is what people use when they have no capital reserve. And there is another trap hidden inside modern housing conversations. People often let a bank's approval rewrite their identity if the lender says yes. They assume the house belongs in their life. Nonsense. A lender approves loans. It does not approve peace of mind. The lender does not have to live in your budget. The lender does not have to save for your retirement. The lender does not care whether your monthly payment quietly crowds out your brokerage contributions for 15 years. The lender certainly does not care whether one surprise expense causes you to start borrowing against credit cards. So the practical lesson is very simple. Do not outsource the affordability decision. Run your own budget. Start with net income, not gross. Use real housing costs, not fantasy costs. Count taxes, insurance, AOA, utilities, repairs, maintenance, and the ordinary wear of life. Do not assume refinancing will rescue you. Do not assume appreciation will justify you. Do not assume your future raises belong to the house before they belong to your family balance sheet. And do not confuse wanting a house with being ready for the house. Those are different conditions. There is a reason I like margin. Margin is what protects sound decisions from bad luck. If you buy with no margin, you are one event away from discovering the true cost of an aggressive mortgage. If you buy with margin, life can be a little unfair and you still remain standing. That, to me, is intelligent ownership. Some people watching this will conclude that the answer is to rent longer. For some of them, that will be the right answer. Some people will conclude that they need to move to a lower cost region. For some of them, that will be the right answer. Some will realize they need a larger down payment. Some will realize they need a second income. Some will realize that the price point they were targeting was never really in their budget at all, only in their imagination. All of those can be useful conclusions because an honest conclusion is far cheaper than a dishonest mortgage. If I summarize the 4 price points plainly, it looks like this in my mind. A $250,000 house probably wants about $85,000 in gross annual income to feel comfortable. A $500,000 house probably wants about $160,000. A $1 million house probably wants about $320,000, maybe more depending on taxes and reserves. A $2 million house probably wants about $700,000, Those are not moral judgments. They are not status judgments. They are not internet judgments. They are simply what the numbers begin to say. Once you stop flattering yourself with gross income and start listening to the money that actually reaches your account. And that is the real housing lesson in 2026. The crisis is not just prices. The crisis is the distance between ordinary earnings and the income required to own even fairly ordinary housing in many parts of the country. That gap creates delay, it creates frustration, it creates later first-time buyers, it creates dependence on family money, it creates household formation problems. It creates the strange national mood where people are told they live in a prosperous country while feeling increasingly locked out of the most basic middle-class asset. I do not solve that problem with slogans. I solve my own small corner of the world with arithmetic and discipline. That is what I would advise you to do too. Run the numbers yourself. Not the bank S numbers, your numbers. Use your take. Home pay. Use your actual bills. Use conservative assumptions. Assume maintenance is real because it is. Assume taxes are real because they are. Assume insurance will not get cheaper by magic. Assume your future deserves some savings and investment room because it does. Then make the decision from strength, not from pressure. If the house fits, wonderful. If it does not, wonderful again. Because now, before the contract rather than after it, there is no shame in not buying a house that does not fit your life. The shame is buying one just to satisfy an idea of adulthood and then spending years serving the payment instead of building wealth. I have never believed in impressing people with liabilities. I would rather be underestimated with liquidity than admired with strain. That principle works in stocks, it works in businesses, and it works in houses. So in a market like 2026, I would keep it very simple. Do not let the lender decide what is comfortable. Do not let the listing photo decide what is sensible. Do not let your gross salary decide what is safe. Let your real cash flow decide. Let your margin decide. Let your ability to sleep well at night decide. Because a house should support your life. Your life should not have to kneel before the house.